Namaste and welcome back to Waking Up with Mindful Serenity Yoga and Nancy. And without further ado, I'm going to reach right into my jar to answer another question. I pull out a question and I attempt to answer it within a 10-minute time frame. And I do so off the cuff, very imperfectly, trying to assimilate all the knowledge I've gained in my 25 plus yoga / everything else studying and practicing. So, wow. Okay, let's see if I can make this out. The question reads, what is the difference between a reflex, reaction, and a response, and what does that have to do with karma? Wow. What is the difference between a reflex, reaction, and a response, and what does that have to do with karma? Now that's a very loaded question. I'm definitely going to need more than one deep breath for this one. So I'll take a deep breath now. And exhale. I'll breathe in again. And exhale. And I'll do my best to attempt to answer this question. I think I'll begin by trying to explain what a reaction is in a way that a physiologist or a neuroscientist might answer that question based on the body. Then I'll try to explain what a reaction is according to a psychologist, for example. And then I would use the yogi's definition of a response in order to explain response, so we see the difference between those two. Basically, what you got right there was that a reflex tends to be more physiological, a reaction tends to be more psychological, and a response tends to be more, I use the word spiritual loosely, say more of a yogi, higher consciousness type of thing. So let's look at that. The other thing I want you to realize when we're talking about the difference between each of this, it's all about the space between the stimulus and the response, okay? So a reflex, there is no space between the stimulus and response. Reaction, there might be a tiny space, but we're not working it, we're not inhabiting it, we're not aware of it. And in a response, we have worked the space, we're aware of the space, we're handling the situation from the space. So a stimulus then is the trigger, the external trigger in the environment that leads to a reaction. Now, or a reflex or a response. In karmic terms, that's basically what karma is, right? We've got to get this old notion of karma out of our minds, that it's a reward or punishment system from the universe for the things we do right or wrong. Karma is just a learning tool. It's the way we can learn to utilize this very natural law that every cause has an effect. Every action, be it a physical action with the body, a mental action, or an energetic action, is going to have an effect or a consequence. And we live out those consequences. The consequences of our actions are our karma. So if we can get into the space between the stimulus, what the external world gives us, and how we respond or react to it, then we have actually mastered the space, and we've gone from our reflexivity to our ability to respond. And responding, when we think of the word responsibility, it's the ability to respond to something in the external way, and in yogic terms, in a very wholesome way that will set us free rather than bind us, as our reflexes and reactions tend to do. Oh wow, that's a big long spiel. So when we're talking about classical conditioning, I'm talking about Ivan Pavlov. You may have heard of him. He did all these experiments way back in the 50s, I believe, with dogs. His intention, maybe even been before the 50s, sorry. His intention was to show how we learn to behave, how our conditioning, which is just our learned behavior that we've accumulated over the years, can be modified and changed by offering different stimuli. And what he did was he tried to feed the dog. he fed dogs, noticing how they salivated before they ate. And so he said, well, food is a natural stimulus for the reaction of salivation, right? It's just it's a reflex, and we'll talk about reflex in a second. And then when he changed the stimuli by using a bell, he still had the same reaction or reflex, the dog salivating. What the difference was he used over time association, positive reinforcement. Every time he rang the bell, the dogs would soon get their food. He increased the space between the time the dogs got their food and the time the bell rang. So he was kind of manipulating that space to create a different reflex, okay? That he was trying to show how our behavior is conditioned and can be modified to some degree by the stimuluses that we are using for reinforcement purposes. Back to what's the difference between a reflex, a reaction, and a response. So a neuroscientist might say, and let's use the example of touching a hot stove, okay? So if you put your hand on a hot stove, almost instantaneously, if your nervous system is working correctly, you're going to pull your hand away, are you not? You're going to recognize the stimulus of heat, and you're going to have an automatic reflex, the pulling back of the hand. It is a reflex because it's physiological. It's a reflex because there's a very limited space between the stimulus and the actual behavior consequence, right? And that is because it didn't have time for the brain to get involved, and I'm going to use the brain, not the mind here, the physiological brain, to get involved to interpret the messages. So physiologically, what normally happens, we have sensory system, as we all know. We have sensory cells and neurons picking up messages from the environment all the times with our eyes, our ears, our nose. Nose goes directly to gray matter, by the way. It's the only one that does. Taste and the sense of touch. All these sensory input is coming into the body. It goes up the sensory neurons, probably up the spinal cord, but it eventually goes to the brain. The brain does most of the interpreting. It goes to the part of the brain called the thalamus. It's like a little post office, which then sends this message here to this part of the gray matter, or the cerebral cortex, this part here, this part here, this part here, so that the brain, the gray matter, can interpret what that message means, and therefore send a message back down to the body to tell the body what to do. And so that takes a little bit of time, just microseconds, but it's still sometimes too much time for us to survive, to get that instinct into us that we need to survive. So what the body also does is it has a reflex mechanism. Instead of the sensory neurons going all the way to the brain, to the thalamus, then to the gray matter, and maybe possibly to the hypothalamus or whatever, the body just says, no, we got to do this quicker. So it goes directly to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord automatically sends a message back through the motor neurons to that part of the body that needs to respond. So in the case of putting our hand on a hot stove, we have such a quick reaction because the brain is not involved. We have the sensory neurons taking the message to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sending, because there's a lot of mixed neurons there, sending the message right back down to the hand to tell the hand to get up off that stove. And that is what we call a reflex. So in terms of understanding in karmic terms what the reflex might be, it's that very limited space, that very limited pause between the stimulus and the reaction or the consequence. Okay, so that's what makes it a reflex. It's automatic. Okay, there's no thinking about it, just boom, it happens. A reaction, on the other hand, and this is where the psychology interpretation might come in, is when there is a little bit of space there. So I'm not necessarily aware of the space. I may not be working the space in the sense that I might not be using that time to come up with a clearer and better and more wholesome response. It's instead of a knee-jerk reflection, there's a little bit of time there where I notice the emotions coming up, and I notice I'm feeling angry, and I notice I'm tensing up, and I'm noticing I'm not liking that stimuli. So when I put my hand on the stove, for example, I'm still have the reflex, but I'm going to be so tense. It's going to feel like old samskaras are being risen up. Maybe I had some issues with abuse before, and where people inflicted pain on me, and that just lifted that up. So I had this sense of, oh my gosh, people are hurting me again, or the universe is hurting me again. It's doing the same thing that the other person did. And I have this sense of being violated and victimized. I may have anger at the person who left the stove on, and I may turn to them and start roaring into them. And that may happen within a short 30 seconds to a minute that this whole reactivity may take place. It's still short or than a response, but it's a little longer than the reflex action. There was some of a pause in there, even though I may not have been aware of it, and just noticing the emotions coming up and that sense of tensing up and how dare this happen to me, or how dare the universe do this to me, or what did I do wrong? The universe has punished me again. Whatever we do when we're feeling that way. That is a reaction, and a psychologist would say that's a very normal reaction. We have no limit. The psychologist might say we have limited control over that. That just happens, right? So let's try to make that more pleasant rather than getting to the root cause of it. A response, on the other hand, and we can look at the yogic interpretation of the response, is that pause between the stimulus, the external event of touching the hot stove, and the consequence of it, what I may do in terms of my action, the effect of it, is the pause is much longer, and I'm utilizing, as a yogi, I'm aware of that pause. I'm utilizing it. I am slipping back into it. I'm observing both the stimuli, the hot stove. Yes, I pulled my hand away. I'm still going to act. But all these internal samskaras that are coming up, or this sense of reactivity I feel inside, I'm observing it and experiencing it. But before I go and react, say before I turn to that person who left the stove on and start yelling and screaming at them, I'm aware of my tendency to want to do that, but I'm just going to allow it to come up and out. I'm feeling the sense of spaciousness. Viktor Frankl said that the space between stimulus and response is where we can be, and it can lead to a much more wholesome response, and it can lead ultimately to our freedom. Because reactivity and reflexing are both bondages for the human being. We are stuck there. But we can move that reactivity, in karmic terms, from reaction to response. We can open up that space and work the pause, so that we are able to sit back in this, realize what we're doing, allow the experience to happen. Yes, I burnt my hand. I can't change that. I pull my hand away. That hurt. I feel that physical sting. I feel the sting of the stuff that's coming up from the past. Instead of trying to push it back down, as we may do in the second part of reactivity, we're just going to allow it to come up and observe it and say, wow, that happened for a good reason. Look at how I feel. That's bringing up these old past memories. Oh, I have to deal with this, whatever. And instead of turning to the person, we may say, that really hurt. I wish you could turn off the stove the next time so no one gets hurt by that. And then there's this forgiveness and this letting it go. And that's response. So that is ultimately the difference between those three R's, as I call them. Reflexing is very quick, very little, automatic, no space or no time to think about it and respond differently. Then reaction is we have a space, but we're not aware of it and we're not utilizing it. And so therefore we're not expanding it, so we have more time to respond healthily. And in response, which may be more the yogic way of doing things, we are taking responsibility for how we react and whatnot. In karma terms, if I'm automatically living through reflexes, someone comes up and slaps me on the face for whatever reason, I'm just going to turn around and slap them fast. That's reflexing. So what's my karma there? Well, even though someone hit me, I hit them back. They may hit me back as part of the karma. There may be some legal consequences for it, whatever. There is going to be some consequences for that reflexing. And that's the life I'm going to live, right? If I'm constantly reacting to what people have to say or these external stimuli, resisting it, because a big part of that reaction when I put my hand on the stove in the reactive component was this resistance to what happened. Oh no, I can't believe that happened. That shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have had the hand on the stove. That stove shouldn't have been left on. I'm resisting the reality of what is, and that really is compressing that pause, that space that Viktor Frankl talked about where our freedom lies. It's constricting it. So when I learn to utilize that space and open it up, allow it to say, yes, it did happen, as I would in the response component, then there's going to be much more a release and less reactivity, less reflexology. And I'm just going to have this sense of freedom. So I'm not dependent on stoves across the world being off, of never getting burned. I may get burned. I may get hurt by things people say or do. Things may happen in my life that might not be pleasant. But I do not have to be reflexive to them or reactive to them. I can respond to them in a healthy and wholesome way. Therefore, my life, in karmic terms, is going to be much more pleasant, much more healing, much more evolved, because that's what karma does, right? It helps us to learn to experience and appreciate the reality of what is as it is, so we can live fully and happily. So that, my dear friends, and I forgot to put my timer on, so I know I went way over, is the explanation of the difference between reflexing, reacting, and responding, and what it has to do with karma. I hope that was enough. Thank you so much for joining me again. I do hope you have an amazingly wonderful day, and I do hope to see you again next time. Namaste.